Welcome to the debate, Off Script, the radical power of not fitting in. Today we analyze the ideas from the book The Unscripted Self.
Right. And we are tackling a profound life challenge today, one that nearly every person faces at some point.
Exactly. It's this deep tension between navigating societal expectations, those invisible scripts that dictate our careers, our relationships, even our bodies. And on the other side, discovering our authentic, unscripted identities to find true belonging.
Yeah. And to be clear, for the remainder of our discussion today, the book itself is going to step into the background. We are going to evaluate the specific methods and frameworks presented in the text as live, actionable proposals for personal transformation.
Right. So, as for my position, I will be arguing that these methods, such as radical acceptance and identity-based habits, possess immense transformative power and provide a foolproof logic for building a life of resilient joy.
And I will be critically questioning the practical efficiency of these proposals, asking whether completely abandoning societal scripts is realistic, sustainable, or simply too risky in the real world.
Okay, let me outline my position right out of the gate. I believe human beings are suffering from an acute ache of inauthenticity. People are just walking around exhausted, completely burnt out, because they're constantly mistaking inherited cultural norms for their own deepest desires. They're performing, right, the role of the successful professional or the perfect partner, the accommodating family member, and this relentless performance creates a profound disconnect from their true selves. So the proposals we are evaluating today, specifically this shift from an outcome-based life to one driven by identity-based habits, offer a brilliant and highly practical architecture for change. By rigorously identifying core values and practicing intentional vulnerability, an individual can move away from the exhausting performance of simply fitting in and transition into the effortless reality of true belonging.
Right.
It is a clear roadmap from obligation to profound alignment.
I approach this from a very different angle. I mean, while the romanticism of living completely unscripted is intellectually appealing, I question if it is a realistic blueprint for modern life. We have to acknowledge that societal scripts, like pursuing a stable, high-paying career or compromising to maintain peace within a difficult family, they often exist for a very practical reason.
Survival.
Survival and stability, exactly. They are the scaffolding of functional societies. Actively tearing down this scaffolding and prioritizing radical self-expression above all else carries huge social and financial risks. I fear that the proposals we're examining today might just gloss over the tangible collateral damage that occurs when you decide to stop playing by the rules of the world you actually live in.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the viability of shedding these invisible scripts. The logic of unmasking doesn't start with some reckless leap. It begins with a very sobering, meticulous self-assessment. We're talking about actively tracking the choices you make out of sheer obligation versus the choices that stem from true internal alignment.
What does that actually look like in practice, though? Tracking choices sounds great in a controlled environment, but how does it map onto a real life?
Well, let's take a Tuesday morning at a mid-level corporate job. You're sitting at your desk, you're preparing for a strategy meeting. The framework asks you to observe your internal state. Are you executing this task because it aligns with your core identity, maybe a desire to solve complex problems or facilitate team growth? Or are you doing it entirely out of a sense of obligation to the linear corporate ladder?
Okay.
The proposal suggests that if you are suffering from deep emotional exhaustion because your definition of success belongs entirely to society and not to you, you must eventually abandon that specific climb. That initial friction, that inciting incident of stepping off the prescribed path to pursue work that actually energizes your spirit, is absolutely necessary to cure the exhaustion that plagues so many people today.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Is this realistic? Because tracking your dread on a Tuesday morning is one thing, but actively abandoning your livelihood because it feels like an inherited script is entirely another. You walk away from that corporate ladder, and you might also be walking away from your ability to pay your mortgage or fund your children's education, secure your retirement.
But the framework isn't advocating for financial ruin. It's arguing that staying in a soul-crushing script will eventually cost you your health, your relationships, and your psychological well-being, which is a much steeper price.
Even so, the practical fallout of abruptly pivoting to unconventional work can be devastating. Furthermore, the idea that compromising to maintain peace or approval is inherently a toxic mask is highly problematic to me. Compromise is often a necessary social lubricant. It is exactly how complex human networks function. If everyone simply abandoned every obligation that didn't perfectly align with their internal energy,
That's not exactly...
if nobody went to the boring meeting or if nobody cooked dinner when they were tired, society would fracture. We cannot entirely discard the utility of playing a role sometimes for the greater good of our families and communities.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The goal is not chaotic rebellion where you shirk all responsibilities. The goal is ensuring your core life architecture isn't built on a foundation of resentment. And frankly, people who are deeply aligned with their unscripted selves are usually much better, more present community members anyway. But let's move to the internal work required to handle the friction of breaking those scripts. When we do step off the path, we face intense societal pushback, which triggers what the text calls the echoes within.
You mean the internal narratives?
Exactly. Past narratives and self-limiting beliefs like, I am not enough, or if I fail at this, I am unlovable. To cure the self-sabotage that these echoes cause, the proposed framework is ART. Acknowledge, reframe, tend. This involves profound introspective exercises, for example, writing a letter to your younger self to explicitly validate the pain of the past, acknowledging that those limiting beliefs were just survival strategies from childhood. By actively challenging those narratives and treating oneself with deep self-empathy, we stop the cycle of self-sabotage that keeps us locked in the scripts.
Does this actually work in the long run, though? That is my primary concern with the ART framework. I question the efficiency of these deep introspective exercises when applied to modern stressors. There is a well-documented psychological risk of getting trapped in a cycle of rumination.
How so? Acknowledging the past isn't the same as living in it.
It can easily become the same thing. When you spend weeks or months validating past pain and writing letters to your younger self, you risk cementing your present identity around your past traumas rather than your current capabilities. You might end up validating the echoes rather than silencing them. Instead of focusing on present-day practical problem-solving, like how to tangibly navigate a difficult conversation with a demanding boss today, you are endlessly tending to the emotional wounds of yesterday. I wonder if this method, rather than producing the promised resilient joy, actually breeds emotional fragility, making individuals far less equipped to handle the blunt force trauma of everyday life.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the ART framework explicitly warns against dwelling in the pain. The reframe and 10 steps are specifically designed to move you out of rumination. It is about illuminating the subconscious pain gently, purely so it loses its invisible power over your present choices. You can't navigate that difficult conversation with your boss effectively if your nervous system thinks your boss is your highly critical parent.
But does treating yourself with that level of extreme tenderness actually prepare you for a world that is not tender?
It prepares you by ensuring you aren't fighting a war on two fronts. And this perfectly transitions into the next proposal: radical acceptance, specifically the RAIN practice.
Recognize, allow, investigate, nurture.
Correct. Recognize the difficult emotion. Allow it to be there without resisting it. Investigate its origin with curiosity. And nurture yourself with the warmth you would offer a dear friend. This is an incredibly efficient tool. The war within, the relentless self-judgment and the pursuit of an impossible, scripted perfection is a massive energy drain. By radically accepting our imperfections through the RAIN method, we cease that internal war. The energy previously wasted on self-hatred is suddenly freed up. That surplus energy is what allows for true, sustainable growth.
Wait, let's break that down for a second.
Investigate sounds analytical, which is fine, but nurture sounds entirely emotional. How are those supposed to work together in the middle of, say, a high-stakes performance review where you are being given legitimate critical feedback?
In that moment, investigate means noticing that your chest is tight and you feel defensive. Nurture means internally saying, it makes sense that I feel threatened right now, but I am safe. It allows you to actually hear the feedback instead of spiraling into a shame cycle.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered what happens when this becomes a baseline operating system? What are the risks of applying RAIN to everything? If the practice is to allow and nurture all difficult emotions and perceived flaws, the most obvious risk is profound complacency. Discomfort, self-critique, and even a healthy dose of self-judgment are often the exact engines that drive human progress.
I think there is a profound difference between self-critique and self-hatred.
Perhaps, but the line is very thin. If we radically accept our imperfections, do we lose the necessary, albeit uncomfortable drive that pushes us toward actual excellence? If I am consistently underperforming at work or being a subpar, inattentive partner, treating myself with the uncritical warmth of a dear friend might just give me permission to stay exactly as I am. Radical acceptance could very easily become a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism against doing the hard, uncomfortable work of genuine self-improvement.
I hear that concern, but I think it misunderstands the mechanics of acceptance. Acceptance isn't resignation. It is simply the accurate assessment of reality, which is the absolute only place from which real improvement can begin. You cannot fix a house if you refuse to look at the broken foundation. Once that internal reality is accurately accepted without shame, the methodology moves strictly into external action, specifically implementing boundaries and building a tribe.
This is where I think the friction between theory and reality becomes most severe.
Let me outline it first. The proposal champions proactive boundary setting. A classic example given is explicitly stating a rule like, I don't respond to emails after 6 p.m. It also heavily utilizes the 4 agreements, particularly the agreement to be impeccable with your word and not make assumptions. The overarching argument is that to find true belonging, you must have the courage and vulnerability to stop being a chameleon. You must draw hard lines and actively filter your relationships until you find a community, a tribe that celebrates your unscripted self rather than merely tolerating the masked version of you.
I come at it from a different way. I look at the real-world application of this rigid boundary setting and see a disaster waiting to happen in highly competitive corporate environments or within incredibly complex, enmeshed family structures. Drawing a hard line in the sand is a luxury not everyone can afford.
But if you don't draw the line, the environment will consume you entirely.
Let's look at your email example. If a junior employee announces they simply will not check emails after 6 p.m. because they are protecting their authentic energy, they aren't going to be celebrated for their boundaries. They are likely to be perceived as abrupt, hostile, or simply uncommitted to the team's shared goals. This can tangibly damage their livelihood and their professional reputation.
I think you're picturing a very dramatic execution of this boundary. The framework, particularly through the lens of being impeccable with your word, doesn't suggest marching into the boss's office and making a grand declaration about your authentic energy. It's about quiet enforcement. You don't declare a boundary. You simply embody it by replying the next morning at 8 a.m., consistently. You train the environment how to treat you.
But even quiet enforcement has consequences. If the cultural expectation of that specific workplace is rapid response, your quiet enforcement will still result in you being passed over for promotions. Similarly, asserting rigid boundaries with a difficult but necessary family member might sever an essential support network. If you refuse to engage with a flawed parent, you might lose the only childcare you can afford. And this idealized tribe of perfectly aligned individuals who celebrate every facet of your unscripted self, I strongly suspect it's a complete illusion. Real human connection requires a massive tolerance for misalignment. It requires enduring the friction of people who do not perfectly get you, but who show up for you anyway.
The framework doesn't demand a utopia of identical minds. That friction you mentioned is exactly why the methodology requires what Viktor Frankl termed tragic optimism. The ability to maintain hope and find profound meaning amidst inescapable pain, friction, and misalignment.
How does tragic optimism fit into filtering your relationships, though?
Because the unscripted life does not promise an absence of struggle. It promises that the struggle will be meaningful because it is yours, rather than a struggle you inherited from a script. And to combat the massive societal pressures and consequences you just rightly pointed out, the proposal doesn't rely on blowing up your life overnight. It relies on micro-interventions, specifically 2-minute identity-based atomic habits.
Such as?
For instance, if your unscripted identity is a writer, but you are trapped in a demanding corporate job, the habit is simply, after I pour my morning coffee, I will sit down and write exactly one sentence of my novel. That's it. You anchor your core values into the tiniest, most undeniable daily actions. This micro-habit approach is the ultimate, highly efficient practical tool for ensuring that your authentic identity survives the gravitational pull of the scripted world. It builds the momentum necessary to eventually change your circumstances without requiring immediate catastrophic risk.
I appreciate the elegance of that approach, but again, let's test it against reality. I acknowledge the philosophical beauty of tragic optimism, but I question if the average person dealing with inflation, childcare crises, and systemic workplace stress has the psychological bandwidth to sustain it constantly. Can a person truly reframe every mundane societal indignity into a profound moment of meaning?
It's not about reframing every indignity. It's about finding a sliver of agency within them.
But it requires a monumental exertion of daily willpower. Furthermore, I challenge whether a 2-minute habit is truly sufficient to combat the heavy gravitational pull of deep-seated trauma or overwhelming societal norms. Writing one sentence a day is a lovely centering practice, but it is a relatively flimsy shield against the crushing weight of structural economic pressure or deeply ingrained family dysfunction. Expecting a microhabit to dismantle a lifetime of invisible scripts feels like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
It is a teaspoon, absolutely, but it is a teaspoon applied consistently every single day, which eventually carves a canyon. It shifts your internal identity from I am a corporate drone to I am a writer who currently works at a corporation. That subtle shift in identity changes how you walk into the strategy meeting on Tuesday morning. To summarize my position on what we've discussed today, aligning our internal values with our daily actions through the mechanisms of radical acceptance, the RAIN method, and microhabits forms a highly efficient and transformative architecture for a fulfilling life. When we stop wasting our energy fighting our own imperfections and performing for others, we gain the clarity and strength to author our own existence.
And to summarize my stance, while I find the introspective tools like the ART framework and the pursuit of core values intellectually fascinating, we cannot ignore the raw mechanics of reality. Dismantling one societal scaffolding, setting rigid boundaries, and abandoning inherited scripts carries very tangible social and financial risks. Sustaining this level of radical authenticity requires an immense amount of privilege, psychological bandwidth, and energy that many people simply do not have in reserve.
As we wrap up, referring back to the overarching themes of the unscripted self, the divide between us is clear. I view these methods as an absolute must-try for anyone looking to reclaim their personal agency and escape the sheer exhaustion of playing a role.
And I advise our listeners to approach these radical proposals with extreme caution. The unscripted life is a beautiful concept, but you must carefully weigh the practical costs of tearing up the script before you have a secure stage to stand on.
We will leave the final verdict to you, the listener. We end today not with a definitive winner, but with a question for you to ponder as you go about your day. How much of the life you are living right now is truly yours, and how much of it is simply a script you are handed? Thank you for joining us.